I regret everything, I should be with my ex instead. My new wife cried after our vows, so I quietly gathered my things and walked out while she discovered what he really was. The words still echo in my head months later, but not because they hurt anymore. They echo because they were the moment everything became crystal clear about who I'd actually married and what I meant to her. I'm Nathan, 34, and I work as a real estate investment advisor here in Dallas. Not the flashiest career, but it's built me a solid life with genuine financial security and professional respect. 3 years ago, I met Isabel at a charity gala downtown. She was this striking brunette who ran her own boutique event planning business, someone who seemed to appreciate both ambition and stability in equal measure. Our relationship developed naturally over shared dinners discussing real estate markets and wedding trends, weekend trips to Austin, and quiet Sunday mornings reading the paper together. I genuinely believed we were building something lasting based on mutual respect and compatible life goals. When I proposed last year at the Botanical Gardens where we'd had our first real conversation about the future, her tears seemed like pure joy. Planning our wedding became this elaborate 18-month project that showcased everything Isabel excelled at professionally. She coordinated every detail with military precision, from the custom floral arrangements to the 7-course tasting menu. We booked the most exclusive country club in Dallas for the ceremony, with the reception following at the Ritz-Carlton downtown. The guest list included 200 of Dallas's most prominent families, business associates, and society figures. Everything was executed flawlessly, from the string quartet during cocktails to the champagne tower at midnight. I watched Isabel work the room like the consummate professional she was, gracefully managing vendors, entertaining guests, and ensuring every moment felt magical. She looked absolutely radiant in her designer gown, and I felt genuinely proud walking down that aisle knowing we were starting our lives together surrounded by everyone who mattered to us. The ceremony itself was everything we'd envisioned, traditional but personal, with vows we'd written ourselves about partnership and building dreams together. During the reception, we danced to the song we'd chosen months earlier, posed for hundreds of photos, and accepted congratulations from friends and family who kept commenting on how perfect we seemed together. I remember thinking during the father-daughter dance that I'd never seen Isabel happier, more confident, more completely in her element. The evening concluded with sparklers on the country club's terrace as we departed for our honeymoon suite at the St. Regis, both exhausted but satisfied that everything had exceeded even our highest expectations. Back in our suite, surrounded by rose petals and champagne, I expected we'd collapse into bed and wake up tomorrow as husband and wife ready to start our honeymoon in Tuscany. Instead, Isabel opened a bottle of wine and became increasingly quiet, staring out the window at the Dallas skyline with this distant expression I'd never seen before. When I asked if she was okay, that's when the dam burst completely. She started sobbing these deep, wrenching tears that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond wedding day exhaustion. Between gasps, she began confessing that throughout our entire ceremony and reception, she'd been thinking about Caleb, her ex-boyfriend from college who'd become some kind of professional race car driver. She told me she'd made a catastrophic mistake marrying me, that Caleb owned her soul in ways I could never understand, and that she'd only chosen me because I represented financial security while he represented everything she actually wanted. As she continued this devastating confession about choosing stability over true love, I quietly started gathering my belongings from around the suite, methodically packing while she explained how she'd been fantasizing about a completely different life during what was supposed to be the happiest day of ours. My groomsman Garrett found me in the hotel lobby at 2 in the morning, still in my tuxedo but carrying my overnight bag like I was checking out of some business trip gone wrong. He'd initially assumed I'd gotten cold feet and abandoned Isabel, ready to lecture me about commitment and responsibility, but when I explained what had actually happened in that suite, his expression shifted from disappointment to complete shock. Garrett had known us as a couple for 3 years, attended countless dinners where Isabel had seemed genuinely invested in our relationship, and he'd never suspected she was harboring this kind of emotional attachment to someone else. He became my strongest supporter once he understood the full scope of what I'd discovered, helping me navigate the immediate logistical nightmare of explaining to both families why the honeymoon was canceled and the marriage was effectively over before it began. My cousin Tiffany, who'd been instrumental in planning many of the wedding details and had invited half of Dallas's social elite, was absolutely humiliated by the scandal and how it reflected on our family's standing in the community. She kept insisting there had to be some way to salvage the situation, that marriages go through rough patches and this was just pre-wedding stress manifesting in an unfortunate way, but I knew there was no recovering from what Isabel had revealed. Her family was equally desperate for damage control, with her mother calling me repeatedly demanding I return to the hotel and work through whatever misunderstanding had occurred, refusing to accept that their daughter had essentially confessed to marrying the wrong man. The story spread through our social circle like wildfire, creating this sharp division where most of the men applauded my decision to walk away with dignity intact, while many of the women insisted I should fight for the relationship and try to win back Isabel's heart through grand gestures. I found the whole dynamic fascinating from a psychological perspective, how people's advice seemed to correlate directly with whether they'd ever been in a situation where they discovered they were someone's second choice. The professional consequences were immediate and complicated, since our real estate and event planning networks overlapped significantly in Dallas's tight-knit business community. Vendors who'd worked our wedding were asking awkward questions about future referrals, mutual clients were taking sides, and I had to decide whether to maintain professional relationships that might require ongoing contact with Isabel. During this chaos, Garrett did some investigative work on social media and discovered that Caleb had been posting from Monaco the morning after our wedding, sharing photos from some international racing circuit with captions about winners and losers in life. The timing felt deliberate, like he knew exactly what was happening in Dallas and was making some kind of statement about the choices people make. His Instagram showed this flashy lifestyle of exotic locations, expensive cars, and beautiful women at racing events, the kind of adventurous existence that probably seemed incredibly appealing compared to suburban Dallas real estate discussions. I spent hours analyzing his posts, trying to understand what Isabel saw in this virtual relationship she'd constructed with someone who'd moved on years ago and was clearly living a completely different life. The more I studied Caleb's online presence, the more I realized Isabel had been competing with a fantasy version of her past rather than dealing with the reality of our present, and that no amount of effort on my part could have changed the fact that she'd never fully committed to building something real with me. Isabel's messages started arriving within hours of my departure, beginning with hysterical apologies and explanations about wedding stress and champagne affecting her judgment, as if alcohol could excuse confessing to marrying the wrong person. Her texts progressed through predictable stages of grief, moving from desperate bargaining about how we could work through this together, to rage about me abandoning her during a vulnerable moment, to elaborate promises about how she'd prove her commitment if I'd just give her another chance. The most revealing messages came later in the week when she admitted she'd been trying to reach Caleb through various racing circuit contacts and social media connections, only to receive complete radio silence from someone who'd apparently moved on from their college relationship years ago. She eventually confessed that she recognized I was completely justified in leaving and that she'd obliterated our future for what she was beginning to understand was an unrealistic dream based more on nostalgia than actual compatibility. Reading her messages, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief instead of heartbreak, like I'd escaped a lifetime of being someone's second choice rather than their genuine first pick. The practical aftermath was a logistical nightmare that kept me busy for weeks, starting with returning thousands of dollars worth of wedding gifts to guests who'd traveled from across the country to celebrate what they thought was the beginning of our life together. We had contracts with luxury vendors for everything from the florist to the photographer, most of which included substantial penalties for cancellation that had to be negotiated case by case. The honeymoon package to Tuscany involved complex refund negotiations with the resort, airlines, and tour companies, all of whom wanted detailed explanations about why a married couple was suddenly requesting individual cancellations. Our shared apartment lease had 6 months remaining, but I couldn't imagine continuing to live in a space filled with engagement photos and wedding planning materials, so I found a corporate housing arrangement downtown while we sorted through who owned what furniture and belongings. The financial implications were staggering when I calculated everything from the non-refundable deposits to the legal fees for annulment proceedings, But I kept reminding myself that discovering Isabel's true feelings before we'd built a life together was actually saving me years of emotional investment in someone who would never fully appreciate what we had. Friends and family members offered endless advice about whether I should consider couples therapy, pursue an annulment versus divorce, or try to salvage something from 3 years of what had seemed like a solid relationship. I appreciated their concern, but I knew that no amount of counseling could address the fundamental issue that Isabel had married me while fantasizing about being with someone else, and that trying to compete with her idealized version of Caleb would be both impossible and degrading. The most difficult conversations were with mutual friends who genuinely couldn't understand why I wouldn't fight for someone I'd loved enough to marry, as if love alone could overcome the devastating reality that she'd never chosen me wholeheartedly in the first place. 3 weeks after our wedding night disaster, Isabel demanded an urgent meeting at Romano's, the upscale steakhouse that had become our traditional spot for celebrating anniversaries and major milestones during our relationship. She claimed to have earth-shattering news about Caleb that would completely transform how I understood our entire situation, insisting this information would change everything between us and prove that her wedding night confession had been based on completely false assumptions. I agreed to meet her primarily out of morbid curiosity about what could possibly justify the emotional devastation she'd caused, though I made it clear this wasn't reconciliation but rather closure for both our sakes. She arrived looking absolutely haggard, like she hadn't slept properly in weeks, wearing clothes that hung loose on a frame that had clearly lost significant weight since our wedding day. The confident event planner who'd orchestrated our perfect ceremony had been replaced by someone who seemed fragile and desperate, constantly checking her phone and fidgeting with her wedding ring like she couldn't decide whether to keep wearing it. She ordered wine immediately and launched into what she described as the most humiliating experience of her entire life, a story that began with her flying to Indianapolis the day after our wedding night confrontation. Apparently, Caleb had been competing in a major IndyCar race that weekend, and Isabel had tracked down his location through racing websites and social media posts, convinced that if she could just talk to him face to face, everything would become clear about their supposedly unfinished connection. She'd driven straight from the Dallas airport to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, spending hundreds of dollars on paddock access passes that would allow her to get close to the racing teams and hopefully encounter Caleb in person. What she discovered completely shattered the fantasy she'd been nurturing for years about their relationship and his feelings toward her. Caleb was sharing a luxury motorhome with someone named Victoria, a stunning blonde who was clearly far more than just a friend based on their obvious intimacy and the way racing team members treated them as an established couple. Isabel spent hours observing them from a distance, watching Caleb and Victoria laugh together, share meals, and display the kind of natural affection that demonstrated a serious, committed relationship that had nothing to do with whatever Isabel thought she'd been maintaining with him through social media interactions. When she finally worked up the courage to approach Caleb after his practice session, hoping to have some kind of meaningful conversation about their history and potential future, his reaction was everything she hadn't expected and absolutely nothing like the romantic reunion she'd envisioned. He treated her with complete indifference, barely acknowledging their shared past and acting like she was some kind of delusional fan who'd misinterpreted casual social media interactions as something deeper and more significant. Caleb made it brutally clear that their college relationship was ancient history, that he'd moved on completely years ago, and that whatever signals Isabel thought he'd been sending through Instagram likes and occasional messages had been purely friendly gestures with no romantic implications whatsoever. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes before Caleb excused himself to return to Victoria and his racing preparations, leaving Isabel standing alone in the paddock area feeling absolutely ridiculous and completely rejected by someone she'd built up in her mind as her soulmate. She admitted spending the next 2 days lurking around various racing venues in Indianapolis, desperately hoping for another opportunity to talk with Caleb and somehow convince him that they belonged together, but he actively avoided her and eventually had racing officials escort her away from areas where she didn't belong. The final humiliation came when Victoria approached her directly, politely but firmly explaining that Caleb was uncomfortable with Isabel's presence and asking her to respect their relationship by leaving them alone. Sitting across from me at Romano's, Isabel described this entire experience with the kind of raw honesty that comes from having your deepest illusions completely destroyed by reality, admitting that she'd sacrificed our marriage for a fantasy that had never existed anywhere except in her own imagination. But the story got worse, much worse, when Isabel began confessing to the extensive covert communication that had been happening between her and Caleb throughout our entire engagement period, revealing a level of emotional betrayal that made her wedding night confession seem like just the tip of an enormous iceberg. She pulled out her phone and showed me months of flirtatious text exchanges, Instagram direct messages, and late-night phone calls that had been happening while we were planning our future together, and I was completely oblivious to this parallel relationship she was maintaining. The messages revealed Caleb deliberately toying with her emotions, sending just enough romantic breadcrumbs to keep her interested while carefully avoiding any real commitment or concrete promises about their future together. He'd mastered the art of making her feel special and desired through carefully crafted responses that suggested deep connection without actually offering anything substantial, playing with her feelings like someone manipulating a sophisticated psychological experiment. The most devastating revelation was that Caleb had sent particularly intoxicating messages the evening before our wedding ceremony, telling her he'd been thinking about what might have been between them and wondering if she ever regretted the choices that had led them down different paths. These messages had arrived while I was at my bachelor party, genuinely excited about marrying someone I believed was as committed to our relationship as I was, completely unaware that my bride-to-be was receiving romantic communications from another man less than 24 hours before our vows. Isabel admitted these pre-wedding messages from Caleb had directly caused her emotional breakdown in our honeymoon suite, filling her head with doubts and fantasies at the worst possible moment and making it impossible for her to focus on what should have been the beginning of our life together. When she'd appeared at the Indianapolis racing compound prepared to abandon everything for him, expecting some kind of romantic movie moment where he'd sweep her away from her mistake, Caleb's reaction had been viciously cruel rather than merely indifferent. He'd called her pathetic for destroying her marriage based on what he described as casual flirtation, told her she was living in a fantasy world if she thought their occasional messages meant anything serious, and advised her to return to her husband and try to repair whatever damage she'd caused to her actual life. The conversation had taken place in front of several racing team members who'd witnessed her humiliation, with Caleb treating her like an unstable stalker rather than someone he'd been encouraging through months of intimate communication. Isabel spent the following days driving between different racing venues across the Midwest, desperately hoping to find Caleb alone so she could somehow explain her feelings and convince him to take her seriously, but he'd apparently warned security personnel about her presence because she was consistently denied access to areas where drivers gathered. She described watching him and Victoria from parking lots and public viewing areas, observing their obvious happiness and genuine affection while realizing that everything she'd believed about her connection with Caleb had been completely one-sided wishful thinking. The final crushing blow came when she overheard Caleb laughing with other drivers about some crazy ex-girlfriend who'd shown up claiming he'd promised her a future together, making jokes about women who can't distinguish between friendly conversation and romantic interest. She realized he'd never intended anything beyond feeding his ego by maintaining a devoted admirer from his past, someone who'd stroke his vanity through occasional messages while he built a real life with someone else entirely. Sitting across from me at Romano's, Isabel looked absolutely broken as she described spending 3 days in cheap roadside motels, finally understanding that her obsession had been completely manufactured in her own mind while Caleb had never seriously considered her as anything more than a convenient source of validation from his college years. After listening to Isabel's complete confession at Romano's, I realized this meeting wasn't about reconciliation but about her desperate need for absolution from someone whose life she'd destroyed, and I made it clear that while I appreciated her honesty, nothing she'd revealed changed the fundamental fact that she'd married me while emotionally committed to someone else. I contacted my attorney the following week to begin annulment proceedings, and fortunately, Isabel's text message evidence of ongoing emotional infidelity during our wedding ceremony provided exactly the legal foundation we needed to petition for fraudulent marriage rather than pursuing a traditional divorce. The legal process moved surprisingly quickly once we demonstrated that Isabel had entered our marriage under false pretenses, essentially committing fraud by exchanging vows while actively maintaining a romantic relationship with another man and planning to leave me for him given the opportunity. Her boutique event planning business began crumbling almost immediately as news of our scandal spread through Dallas's tight-knit high society network, where reputation and discretion are absolutely essential for success in the luxury wedding industry. Potential clients started canceling consultations once they heard whispers about the event planner who destroyed her own perfect wedding for an imaginary relationship with a race car driver, and existing clients began questioning whether someone so unstable could be trusted with their important celebrations. The professional consequences were swift and merciless in a city where social connections drive business referrals, and within 3 months, Isabel was forced to close her boutique and move back with her parents in rural Oklahoma, a devastating fall from the sophisticated Dallas lifestyle she'd worked years to build. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of Isabel's obsessive pursuit were destroying Caleb's life in ways none of us had anticipated, creating chaos that extended far beyond our failed marriage into his professional racing career and personal relationships. Garrett had been monitoring racing news and social media, discovering that Isabel had begun appearing uninvited at racing venues across the country, showing up at tracks from California to Florida wherever Caleb was competing and creating increasingly uncomfortable situations for everyone involved. Her behavior had escalated from desperate attempts at conversation to disrupting sponsor meetings, harassing racing team members for information about Caleb's schedule, and even approaching Victoria with bizarre claims about having prior rights to Caleb's affections based on their college relationship. The racing community is relatively small and tight-knit, so word spread quickly about the unstable woman who was stalking one of their drivers, and track security began recognizing Isabel and denying her access to paddock areas before she could create scenes. Her persistence became genuinely frightening when she started following Caleb's motorhome between cities, checking into hotels near racing venues, and somehow obtaining his personal phone number to send dozens of calls and messages daily about their supposed destiny together. The situation reached a breaking point when Isabel's obsessive behavior began affecting Caleb's relationship with Victoria, who understandably couldn't handle the stress of having a delusional stalker disrupting their life together and threatening her sense of safety at racing events. Victoria eventually issued an ultimatum demanding Caleb take legal action to stop Isabel's harassment, and when he hesitated to involve law enforcement against someone from his past, she ended their relationship and moved out of their shared motorhome. Caleb's racing performance suffered dramatically as he dealt with the emotional turmoil of losing Victoria, the practical challenges of having his schedule disrupted by security concerns, and the professional embarrassment of being associated with stalking drama that was becoming gossip fodder throughout the racing circuit. His sponsors began expressing concern about the negative publicity surrounding their investment, questioning whether Caleb could maintain the focused, professional image they required for their marketing partnerships. Within 6 months, Isabel's relentless pursuit had cost Caleb both his serious relationship and several lucrative sponsorship deals, essentially destroying the glamorous racing lifestyle that had originally attracted her obsession and proving that her fantasy about their connection was toxic for everyone involved. Following the annulment, my life transformed in ways I never could have anticipated during those dark days immediately after our wedding night disaster, proving that sometimes the most devastating experiences lead to the most profound personal growth and unexpected opportunities for genuine happiness. I threw myself into work with renewed focus and energy, channeling the analytical skills that had made me successful in real estate investment into rebuilding every aspect of my personal and professional existence with deliberate intention rather than simply reacting to circumstances. Within 8 months, my dedication and improved performance earned me a partnership promotion at the investment firm, along with a substantial salary increase that allowed me to purchase a sleek downtown Dallas penthouse with panoramic city views and absolutely no painful associations with my previous life. The new apartment represented everything I'd learned about authentic independence and self-worth, decorated with modern furniture I'd chosen myself rather than compromise pieces selected to accommodate someone else's preferences and financial limitations. I began a relationship with Samantha, a pediatric nurse I met through Garrett's girlfriend at a charity fundraiser for children's cancer research, someone whose genuine warmth and professional dedication immediately distinguished her from the superficial social climbers I'd been encountering in Dallas's dating scene. Samantha chose to be with me because she genuinely appreciated my stability, my thoughtful approach to building relationships, and my commitment to treating partnership as an equal collaboration rather than viewing me as a financial security blanket or settling for me while fantasizing about someone else. Our relationship developed naturally through shared values about family, career ambition, and creating meaningful connections with people who matter, rather than the exhausting performance of trying to impress each other with expensive restaurants and designer accessories that had characterized my time with Isabel. Samantha insisted on splitting dinner checks during our early dating period, contributed her own furniture and decorating ideas when she started spending weekends at my penthouse, and showed genuine interest in my investment projects because she found financial planning intellectually fascinating rather than just expecting me to handle all monetary decisions unilaterally. The contrast was absolutely striking when I realized how much energy I'd been wasting trying to satisfy someone who viewed my professional success as her personal entitlement rather than something we could build together through mutual support and shared goals. I gained profound insights about the vital distinction between being someone's genuine romantic choice versus their practical compromise, understanding that authentic love means being chosen wholeheartedly rather than being selected as the safer option while someone fantasizes about alternatives they consider more exciting or desirable. Reflecting on my relationship with Isabel, I recognized numerous red flags I'd ignored or rationalized away, from her constant social media monitoring of ex-boyfriends to her subtle complaints about our quiet lifestyle compared to the adventurous existence she claimed to want but never actively pursued through her own efforts. The experience taught me that no amount of financial generosity, thoughtful gestures, or relationship investment can compensate for the fundamental incompatibility that exists when someone views you as their consolation prize rather than their first choice, and that competing for affection with idealized memories or fantasy relationships is both impossible and deeply damaging to self-respect. I felt absolutely zero regret about walking out of that honeymoon suite, recognizing that staying to fight for someone who'd publicly confessed to preferring another man would have been devastating to my dignity and ultimately pointless since genuine attraction and commitment cannot be negotiated or earned through persistence. The wisdom I gained from this experience proved invaluable in recognizing Samantha's authentic appreciation for exactly who I am rather than who she might want me to become, and in building a relationship based on mutual respect rather than one-sided emotional labor and financial support. Almost 2 years later, Samantha and I are planning our own wedding, but this time I'm confident I'm marrying someone who chose me because she genuinely wants to build a life together, not because I represent safety while she dreams about excitement elsewhere. The proposal happened naturally during a quiet Sunday morning in our penthouse, sharing coffee and reading the newspaper together, the kind of peaceful domestic moment that Isabel had always treated as boring but Samantha treasures as intimate connection with someone she actually loves. I never heard from Isabel again after our annulment was finalized, though Garrett occasionally shared updates about her continued struggles in Oklahoma and the restraining orders that eventually became necessary to stop her harassment of Caleb and his racing associates. Her confession that night, while crushing at the time, ultimately liberated me to discover what real love feels like when someone chooses you authentically rather than settling for you reluctantly, and I'm genuinely grateful that her honesty, however painful, prevented me from wasting years trying to earn affection from someone whose heart belonged elsewhere.